Welcome everyone to Couch Potato Diary. My name is Peter Klein. Thank you very much for tuning in today. We are going to continue our Major League Baseball preview looking at the undervalued teams on the win-loss projections from Las Vegas. We're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at the Blue Jays who could fall off this season, and also looking at players on the hot seat who is facing some pressure and could be on the move if they do not step up for their teams. So that is the focus today. As always, we are presented by Sea of Dead. Check out seaofdead403.ca for that great Calgary swag. Also, check out swiftenergy.gg. Use the code PKPrimetime. Get that fuel at swiftenergy.gg. Use the code PKPrimetime for the 25% off. So, caveat again, taping this a couple of weeks ago from when you are hearing it and seeing it today. So if there's a couple of things that might be a little bit off on this, apologies, but I'm off in Japan, so kind of bulk creating, as they like to say. So we are going to dive right in though, even if some things are a little bit off. I still think there's enough good analysis in here that it's worth your while to hang out today. So let's look at the teams undervalued by Las Vegas, maybe the most underrated teams in Major League Baseball going into the 2025 season. Every year, we think we have it down. Every year, we know who's going to win how many games. But evidently, we're always off on a few. And Vegas sometimes underrates a few teams. Today, we're going to look at the teams that have been underrated by Las Vegas, looking at the most undervalued teams in Major League Baseball. Let's start with a couple of teams who we broke down on the National League preview yesterday. Let's look at the Arizona Diamondbacks. Their win total is set at 86.5. And I think when you have those top three at the top of your rotation, and then you have Rodriguez or Montgomery who could have a breakout, then you're going to be really competitive. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think this offense is underrated. With Carroll at the top, Marte, they go out and acquire Naylor who can just mash, and Lourdes Gurriel Jr., who can go on some real runs with the bat, and then some secondary pieces with Moreno and some other guys there as well. I just think that this is a bit more of a complete team than people are giving them credit for, and I think that we watched them go to the World Series and watched them falter in the World Series, and then when they don't bounce back the next year, it's like, okay, well, they're done and out of the conversation, because you have a lot of bright, shiny toys, with the Giants getting Adames, with the Padres always getting someone, and the Dodgers being the Dodgers. These guys kind of get forgotten about in the National League West, but I really do think there's a very good baseball team in there, and one that is going to give teams a lot of problems. And I think we're going to look at the standings at some point. It's like, okay, well, guess the Diamondbacks are just awesome again. That's where I am with them. The Cubs, 85.5 wins. I think they're undervalued at that as well. I think they have a very easy division to maneuver, and going out and acquiring Tucker as the centerpiece, you would have loved to have paired that with Bellinger instead of losing him for basically nothing, but you still have one of the premier players in baseball on your team, or a guy who potentially could be that anyway for at least a season. Like a little bit more around him throughout the Diamond, but I still think that they are so easily the best team in that Central Division that there is going to be, with a good manager, that there's going to be some opportunities to get some easy wins for the Cubs coming up this season and really kind of bump up that win total. Let's move to the American League now. The Detroit Tigers, I think, are undervalued. Somewhat similar to the Cubs here. It's an easy division, and I think they have the most complete team in it right now. I think that there is obviously an ace at the top of that rotation. I think that some of the bats probably start to develop a little bit more this season, and I don't think after how last season went that if they're close to it around the deadline that they're going to be sellers once again. I think that this is a team that is ready to not break out in a big time way, like whoever they play in the first round of the playoffs, I think beats them probably, but I do think that this is the best team in that division right now. Moving out to the National League West, I think the Rangers are undervalued a little bit at 85.5 wins. They are healthier than they were last year, and now I think they have a chance with the Astros being a little bit down as well. I think there's an opportunity for the Rangers to kind of bounce back after not a phenomenal defense of their World Series, where we know that there is a lot of talent on this team, and just a lot of them kind of hit a wall last year. But I think with DeGrom, whatever you get from him, with DeGrom as the centerpiece of that rotation, and still with Seager and Semien at the top of that lineup, a whole lot is possible with this team. Gonna stay in that division, though, and go with the Mariners. I think they have the best rotation in baseball. The division feels wide open, and I just can't believe that Julio Rodriguez is going to get off to the slow start that he had a season ago. I think there is an absolute superstar in that kid. And so I think that given now some injury issues in the pitcher rotation, but given what they have in that rotation, and given some of the guys who I think can still hit enough, I think that there is, again, a playoff team in Seattle. And I think that they have been aggressive around trade deadlines before, and I think that they will be again, kind of understanding that it's been too often close but no cigar, with Houston maybe being a little bit more vulnerable with no Bregman, with no Tucker. I think that Seattle has a chance to really take a shot here. So I think we've talked about two very interesting teams in the American League West here today. Let's now go to the Toronto Blue Jays. They are the team that I focus on out here the most, and so do a little bit extra in the season previews with them as the season goes on. For more Blue Jays stuff, there's a playlist created on YouTube called the Catlin Autocast. It's Blue Jays podcast I started for a little bit, but have now just basically transitioned into where I put all the Blue Jays content on YouTube. If you're listening in podcast, Blue Jays Breakdown was last week looking at guys who could bounce back. So today, it's going to be a little bit more negative as we look at players who could fall off for the Toronto Blue Jays in the 2025 season. The Toronto Blue Jays have a ton of pressure and a ton of expectations, and last year did not live up to any of those. But there are still a couple of guys who might fall off a little bit more from a season ago. Who are the fall-off candidates for the Toronto Blue Jays in the 2025 season? Well, as mentioned before, it was not a banner year for the Toronto Blue Jays last year. And so the good news is it's tough to pick a fall-off candidate when everybody fell off a season ago. But I still looked at a couple of guys on here. There's someone at 960 is going to be a little upset with me when I pick this one. But I think Ernie Clement is a fall-off candidate. He had 263 last year with 12 home runs. I think both of those could be all like career Blue Jay highs when all is said and done for him. And I get like his batting average a couple of seasons ago was actually higher, but it was in 24 games. So when looking at like qualifying seasons, I think these could be career highs for him. He is a phenomenal defensive player, but I do think that as baseball kind of figures him out, that there's going to be maybe a few more lows for him. And one of the talk a lot was that he's just gearing up for a fastball, so just don't throw him a fastball. He kind of figured it out. To his credit, he figured that out, and he hit quite well against sliders and splitters this year, but he hit almost unsustainably well against those. And so even if there is a bit of a normalization and a bit of a bounce back against fastballs this year for him, I can't see him hitting that well against splitters and against sliders specifically. And so I do think there's going to be a bit of a drop off for him. Again, he's going to be a useful player for the Toronto Blue Jays as a glove, but I think from a hitting standpoint, to just pencil him in 13 points ahead of the Mendoza line and with 12 home runs, I think would be being remarkably optimistic around a guy who I just don't see consistently being around those levels. And the other one in the pitching rotation is Bowden Francis. 3.03 ERA last year, really solid. And I think he's a really good pitcher. But I do think now there could be a bit of a touch of a step back with the rest of baseball, kind of figuring out where he is and figuring out who he is and getting a bit of an understanding on that. And so I think like the win totals could go up because the team's going to be better. I think that he is going to have a few easier pitching matchups because he's probably penciled in as like a 4-5 guy right now, and there were times he was the 3 with the Blue Jays a season ago. But I do think that ERA kind of goes up a little bit more as people get a little bit more familiar with his tendencies and start to figure him out a little bit more as well. So I think that there could be a bit of a drop-off for Bowden Francis this year, but I think the Blue Jays have done a good job of kind of solidifying both of these, actually, with some of the additions. Like in the pitching rotation, it is the acquisition of Max Scherzer that just gives you a little bit of breathing room, and one that I think it's why I was saying it was so important, because now instead of hoping that Francis can maybe even be a 3 if Bassett doesn't bounce back in the way that you want, now you can kind of comfortably throw him in as a 5 and just whatever you get is whatever you get. And if he doesn't fall off, if he is just a right around 3 ERA guy, then that is a phenomenal thing to have as a number 5 in your rotation. And so that's why I think there was a little bit of a cushion built in there by acquiring a Max Scherzer. And the same thing with Ernie Clement. If there is a touch of a fall off, I think going out and getting the power of Anthony Santander, and then hoping for, as we talked about, bounce backs from Bo Bichette and Alejandro Kirk, and maybe a continuation of what we saw from a Will Wagner will just kind of offset a little bit of what you, not even just offset, but really mask a little bit of the drop that you may have from an Ernie Clement. So I do think the Blue Jays kind of set themselves up in a pretty good way around that. Let's get back to the rest of the Major League Baseball preview now, as we look at players on the hot seat. A little bit later on, we'll look at coaches who are on the hot seat, and that's a bit more of a traditional whatever. That one's easy. It's which managers are under the most pressure. But these are players on teams that fancy themselves at least around contention, that are making some pretty good money, in a couple of cases, really good money, that really need to have bounce back years. And if they don't, there could be some kind of a move that is made. So these are the players on the hot seat going into the 2025 Major League Baseball season. So, Major League Baseball's season, again, right around the corner, and that means it's time for the seats to heat up a little bit. Later on in the MLB previews, we'll be looking at the coaches on the hot seat, but today we're going to look at the players who are facing some job potential issues if some not great play continues. Players on the hot seat for the 2025 season. We begin with George Springer. It was a down year for George Springer out in Toronto. And if there is another one, which a lot of people are anticipating, I think the Blue Jays, if it's a down season for Springer, there could be a real concern that it's kind of a down year for the Blue Jays. And I'm not saying as he goes, they go, because there's a lot of talented players on this team still. But I do think that if this is a fall off year again for Toronto and Springer is still just kind of muddling around, the Blue Jays, they've brought in some younger players, like a Loper Fido, even like a Straw and those guys. Like they've brought in some young kids who they might want to take a look in one of those corner outfield spots. And so honestly, the Blue Jays, they have the financial ability to kind of just cut bait if they have to. And they've talked about kind of flexing those financial muscles. If they have to do that in a rebuilding sense, I could see them just Springer out of here, or just retain whatever, sending cash however much you need, and just kind of bailing on this one. So I think George Springer, in terms of keeping a job with the Blue Jays, and I don't want to say, I don't think he's playing in Japan next year, but I do think in terms of his reputation and having a starting spot in Major League Baseball, this is a very, very big season for him. Dansby Swanson is another one for me. A bit of a disappointing last couple of seasons. And now there's expectations out in Chicago. And now there's pressure out in Chicago a little bit. And so I just feel like there is a pressure on him to step up, and a pressure on him to be a secondary piece around a Kyle Tucker and really help round out this offense a little bit. And with that move for Tucker and a couple of moves the Cubs have made in the last couple of off seasons, this is a win now baseball team. And if Dansby Swanson ends up not now being a win now player, I think that they could look to upgrade that position around a trade deadline time and try to move on from him. Again, it's a big contract, but they're the Cubs. They have money to deal with big contracts. And the last one, this one, it feels a little bit unfair, but it's Rhys Hoskins. Coming off of injury problems, he had a prove-it year last year. He did not prove it. Now it's desperation time. The Brewers desperately need any kind of bat at all to do anything in this organization. And if he is not going to be that guy, then odds are this is going to be a rebuilding year in Milwaukee anyway, and the start of a rebuilding time in Milwaukee. And so they'll probably try to find some kid somewhere who can play either DH or a corner infield spot, or wherever you would want to put Hoskins. I think that if this is not the bounce back year that he needs, and a lot of people want to see from him, right? He was a promising player, injuries get in the way, great team success without him. All of that just has to be really tough to deal with. And so you want for the player for this to be a bounce back year, and Milwaukee kind of needs it for the player to have a bounce back year. So those are the three players that I think are on the hot seat in Major League Baseball, at least to start the 2025 campaign. That's going to do it for the show today. If you're watching on YouTube, give the video a like, give me a subscribe, and let me know in the comments anything that you have agreements or disagreements with today. Let me know. We talked about players on the hot seat, Blue Jays falling off, and also some underrated, undervalued teams in Major League Baseball this year. What do you think of everything we talked about today? Leave a comment down below. If you're listening in podcast form, leave a review, subscribe, follow, whatever you need to do on the podcast, but all that stuff really does help as we're trying to grow this thing. The baseball previews are going to continue coming up on Friday's episode. We're going to look at Blue Jays who could break out in the 2025 season, plus coaches on the hot seat and the players who will decide the 2025 season. Not necessarily the best players, but guys who, if they play well or they don't, really could shift a lot of dynamics across Major League Baseball. So it's going to be a fun episode tomorrow. Thank you guys so much for hanging out today. Enjoy the rest of your days. Enjoy some baseball. And we'll talk again on Friday. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.